When the guns finally fell silent in May 1945, the world was left to reckon with the wreckage of the most destructive conflict in human history. Governments collapsed, borders were redrawn, cities lay in ruins, and millions upon millions of ordinary people faced a future that looked nothing like the world they had known before. But while history has devoted enormous attention to the fates of the generals, the politicians, and the war criminals who stood trial at Nuremberg and beyond, there is another group of people whose stories have too often gone untold. The women who stood beside the most powerful and most ruthless men of the 20th century, and the children who were born into the shadow of their fathers' crimes. What happened to the wives of Adolf Hitler's inner circle once the Reich collapsed? What became of the sons and daughters of men who orchestrated the Holocaust, who governed with terror, who sent millions to their deaths? Did they escape justice? Did they try to atone? Did they spend their lives defending the indefensible? The answers are far more complicated, far more haunting, and in some cases, far more surprising than most people ever realize. In this video, we are going to explore the full, unvarnished story of what became of the women who married the monsters and the children who grew up in the shadow of some of the darkest crimes in human history. From the wives of Nazi Germany's most powerful figures, to the spouses and offspring of dictators and tyrants across the globe, these are the stories that history has long pushed into the margins. So, without further ado, let us begin with the woman whose loyalty to one of the most notorious regimes in human history never wavered, even decades after it had been reduced to ash and rubble. Ilse Hess was a woman defined entirely by her devotion to a cause that the rest of the world would ultimately condemn as an unforgivable evil. Born Ilse Pruhl in 1900, she came of age in an era of tremendous political upheaval in Germany. And like so many young Germans of her generation, she was swept up in the nationalist fervour that would eventually give rise to National Socialism. She first joined the Nazi Party in 1921, in those early volatile days when Adolf Hitler was still a fringe agitator in the beer halls of Munich, rather than the Chancellor of Germany. When the party was banned following the failed beer hall putsch of 1923, Ilse rejoined once it was re-established in 1925, signalling that her commitment was not casual or opportunistic, but deeply ideological. It was through these circles that she came to know Rudolf Hess, the man who would become Deputy Führer and Hitler's most personally devoted follower. The relationship between Ilse and Rudolf was not an immediate romance. Hess was reserved and cautious, hesitant to commit, and it was Ilse who had to exercise patience before their courtship truly developed. In a detail that speaks volumes about the social dynamics within Hitler's inner circle, it was Adolf Hitler himself who played an active role in facilitating and ultimately encouraging the marriage between Ilse and Hess. Hitler regularly attended social gatherings hosted by wealthy women who supported the Nazi movement, and it was in these settings that he came to appreciate Ilse's steadfast loyalty and her ability to manage the complex personalities of the party elite. He actively pushed Hess toward the union, and the two were married on December 20th, 1927, in Munich. Hitler stood as godfather to their only child, Wolf Rüdiger Hess, who was born in 1937. A role that underscored just how deeply intertwined the personal and political lives of the Nazi inner circle truly were. Throughout the years of the Third Reich, Ilse Hess was a model of ideological commitment. She threw herself into the world of Nazi high society, attending events, supporting party causes, and maintaining the social fabric of a movement that was perpetuating some of the worst atrocities in modern history. Her loyalty was tested in the most dramatic possible way in May 1941, when her husband Rudolf Hess undertook one of the most bizarre episodes of the entire war, a solo flight to Scotland in a desperate and ultimately futile attempt to negotiate a peace deal with the United Kingdom. The mission was a catastrophic failure. British authorities immediately arrested Hess upon his arrival, and Hitler, furious and embarrassed, publicly declared Hess mentally unwell in an attempt to distance himself from the debacle. Back in Germany, Ilse faced enormous pressure and scrutiny. Yet rather than quietly distancing herself from her husband or the regime, she stood firmly by both. She continued to defend Rudolf's intentions and maintained that his mission had been an act of genuine patriotism and peacemaking, a view that the vast majority of historians and legal scholars have long rejected. The flight was widely regarded by Allied authorities and historians alike as either a delusional peace mission or a symptom of Hess's increasingly unstable mental state, and it did nothing to alter the course of the war or the fate of the millions being murdered by the regime he had helped to build. The end of the war brought immediate consequences for Ilse Hess. She was arrested by Allied forces in the aftermath of Germany's surrender, and like many wives of high-ranking Nazis who had been convicted or executed in the Nuremberg trials, she was sent to an internment camp in Augsburg. The camp was a far cry from the comfortable, privileged existence she had enjoyed as the wife of the Deputy Führer, but Ilse endured it without apparent regret or remorse. When she was finally released, she relocated to the Allgäu region of Bavaria, and by 1955 had established herself as the owner of a modest boarding house, building a quiet life for herself and her son in the foothills of the Alps. But quiet did not mean reformed. Until her very last days, Ilse Hess remained an unreconstructed true believer in National Socialism and in the personal greatness of Adolf Hitler. She provided active support to the Stille Hilfe, a shadowy relief organisation that worked to provide assistance to convicted, condemned and fugitive members of the SS, an organisation that many German authorities considered a network for helping war criminals evade justice. Her correspondence in the post-war years included known admirers of Hitler and individuals connected to neo-Nazi networks. In 1952, she published a book entitled England, Nuremberg, Spandau, Ein Schicksal in Briefen, a work that presented her husband's story in an admiring and defiant light and attracted considerable attention from those sympathetic to the old regime. Perhaps her most enduring post-war activity was her tireless campaign to secure Rudolf Hess's release from Spandau prison, where he remained the sole prisoner for many years after all other convicts had either been released or died. She wrote letters, gave interviews, organised petitions, and lobbied foreign governments, all in service of a man who had been a central figure in one of history's most criminal regimes. Rudolf Hess died on August 17, 1987, at the age of 93 in what was officially ruled a suicide by hanging. His son Wolf and many others, including Ilse, refused to accept that conclusion, insisting he had been murdered by his British captors. Ilse Hess herself passed away on September 7, 1995, at the age of 95, leaving behind a legacy that was inseparable from the darkest chapters of European history. She had never expressed remorse, never distanced herself from the ideology that had led to the deaths of tens of millions, and had dedicated more than half a century of her post-war life to rehabilitating the reputation of men who had helped make those deaths possible. Margret Himmler stands as one of the most morally troubling figures among the women of the Nazi inner circle. Not simply because of who she was married to, but because of the extent to which her own words and actions documented a knowing, active participation in the worldview of the regime. She was the wife of Heinrich Himmler, the Reichsführer SS and the single most powerful architect of the Holocaust, a man who oversaw the construction and operation of the concentration camp system that murdered millions of Jews, Roma, disabled individuals, political prisoners, and countless others. Before she became Himmler's wife, Margret had trained as a nurse during the First World War, a profession associated with compassion and the saving of human life. After the war, she transitioned to work with the German Red Cross hospital and, with financial support from her father, even managed her own private nursing clinic. These professional origins make what she later became all the more jarring. She first met Heinrich Himmler during one of his lecture tours in 1927, and his attraction to her was immediate. He was captivated by her blue eyes and blonde hair, features that aligned perfectly with the racial ideals of the movement he was in the process of joining. They married in July 1928, despite some initial awkwardness stemming from the age difference between them, the fact that Margret had been previously married, and the concern that her Protestant faith might not sit well with his Catholic family. Eventually, his family accepted the match, and on August 8, 1929, the couple welcomed their only biological daughter, Gudrun, into the world. Margret was not simply a passive figure in the background of her husband's activities. She joined the Nazi Party in 1928 and became an active participant in the social world of the SS hierarchy, regularly organising gatherings for the spouses of high-ranking SS leaders. She was, by most accounts, not particularly well liked in these circles. During the Nuremberg rally of 1938, she managed to alienate the other wives so thoroughly that they collectively refused to follow her lead in various social arrangements, a remarkable act of internal dissent within a world that otherwise demanded absolute conformity. But it is her own written words that most powerfully document her attitudes toward the victims of the Nazi occupation. Her diary contains an account of a trip to German-occupied Poland in March 1940, during which she visited Posen, Łódź, and Warsaw. What she recorded in those pages was not sympathy or discomfort at what she witnessed, but contempt and dehumanization of the most explicit kind. Due to her work organising Red Cross hospitals across Berlin-Brandenburg and through her missions to occupied territories, Himmler eventually achieved the rank of colonel within the German Red Cross, a title that stands in grotesque irony, given what the SS was doing in those same occupied territories throughout the war. By 1941, the marriage had effectively collapsed emotionally, though not legally. Margaret discovered that her husband was secretly involved with his personal secretary, Hedwig Potthast, with whom Himmler had fathered 2 children. The betrayal was personal and humiliating, but Margaret remained connected to the world of the SS nonetheless. After the war ended, Margaret was subjected to extensive investigation by Allied denazification authorities, and it was not until 1953 that the authorities reached their conclusion. Margaret Himmler was deemed a profiteer of the Nazi regime. She was sentenced to 30 days of penal labour, stripped of her voting rights, and made ineligible for a pension. After her release, she attempted to disappear into post-war German society, living under the pseudonym Margarete Boden until her death in 1967. Lena Heydrich entered the story of Nazi Germany through a door opened by ideology and family connection. Her brother Hans was an ardent member of both the Nazi Party and the SA, and his passionate advocacy for the movement was instrumental in leading Lena to attend a party rally in 1929, where Adolf Hitler delivered one of his characteristically electrifying speeches. The experience made a profound impression on the young woman, and she subsequently joined the Nazi Party herself. The pivotal personal turning point in her life came at a rowing club ball in the city of Kiel, where she was 19 years old. It was there that she met a young naval lieutenant named Reinhard Heydrich, a tall, athletic, and deeply ambitious man who would go on to become one of the most feared figures in the entire Nazi hierarchy. Their engagement was announced on December 18, 1930, but the path to marriage was immediately complicated by scandal. Shortly after the engagement became public, Heydrich was brought before a naval court of honour on charges of conduct unbecoming an officer for having violated a prior engagement promise to another woman. The court found against him, and in April 1931 he was dismissed from the Navy, suddenly without a career or income at the age of 27. It was at this critical moment that Lena Heydrich's influence on the course of history became most direct. It was she who suggested that Reinhard should consider opportunities within the newly established SS, recognizing the organization's growing importance within the Nazi movement. He took her advice, and when Heydrich presented Heinrich Himmler with his ideas for an SS intelligence service, Himmler was so immediately impressed that he appointed Heydrich on the spot as the chief of what would eventually become known as the SD, or Sicherheitsdienst. From that meeting onward, Reinhard Heydrich rose with astonishing speed through the SS hierarchy, eventually becoming the head of the Reich Security Main Office and one of the chief planners of the final solution. He chaired the Wannsee Conference in January 1942, the meeting at which senior Nazi officials coordinated the bureaucratic machinery of the genocide they were already perpetrating. He was assassinated in Prague on June 4, 1942, following an attack by Czech and Slovak paratroopers trained in Britain, making him the highest-ranking Nazi official to be killed in an operation by Allied trained forces during the war. As a personal acknowledgement of Heydrich's dedication to the Nazi cause, Hitler had gifted Lena with a large estate in rural Bohemia, a luxurious property that the family occupied throughout the war years. Historical accounts suggest that Lena kept prisoners at the estate for forced labour, and there are allegations that she physically abused some of them, though the full extent of her personal involvement in this exploitation was never legally adjudicated. The post-war trajectory of Lena Heydrich's life was one of determined legal combat and unrepentant loyalty to her first husband's memory. She was acquitted in the West German denazification proceedings, a result that many found deeply unsatisfying, given her evident involvement in the structures of the Nazi state. She then fought two separate court battles against the West German government in 1956 and 1959, ultimately succeeding in securing a widow's pension, a decision that caused enormous controversy given that her husband had been among the principal architects of the genocide that killed 6 million Jews. Czechoslovakia sentenced Lena to life imprisonment in absentia for her alleged role in crimes committed on Czech soil, but she was never extradited. In 1965, while on vacation in Finland, she met a Finnish theatre director named Mauno Manninen, and the two eventually married, a move motivated at least partly by the practical desire to change her surname. For a time, she managed her former husband's summer house on the island of Fehmarn, converting it into a restaurant and inn. In 1976, she published a memoir titled Life with a War Criminal, in which she defended Reinhard Heydrich's reputation with a tenacity that many found morally incomprehensible. Lena Heydrich died on August 14, 1985, at the age of 74, still a defender of the man whose name had become synonymous with organized terror and the systematic murder of millions. Emmy Goering occupied a unique position among the women of Hitler's inner circle, styling herself quite literally as the First Lady of the Third Reich, a self-appointed title that placed her in direct and lasting conflict with the other women who moved in those rarefied circles. An accomplished actress before her marriage, Emmy Sonnemann caught the eye of Luftwaffe Chief Hermann Goering, and the two were married on April 10, 1935. In a ceremony of almost operatic grandeur attended by Hitler himself and broadcast on radio. In an entertaining detail that reveals the peculiar social dynamics of the Nazi elite, Emmy did not actively seek Nazi Party membership for herself, but was gifted an induction certificate as a Christmas present in 1938, an extraordinary moment that perfectly captures the way in which the apparatus of the totalitarian state had become woven into the fabric of everyday private life. Emmy's assumption of the role of First Lady brought her into immediate and sustained conflict with Eva Braun, Hitler's longtime companion and eventual wife. Eva Braun, despite her close personal relationship with Hitler, was kept almost entirely out of public life by the Führer. Emmy's very public enjoyment of social prominence and her dismissive treatment of Eva Braun infuriated Hitler, who eventually demanded that Hermann Goering instruct his wife to treat Eva with proper respect. One direct consequence of Emmy's disdainful attitude was her exclusion from the Berghof, Hitler's private Bavarian retreat. For Emmy's part, the war years were characterized by extraordinary material privilege. Hermann Goering's vast collection of stolen art, seized from Jewish families and museums across occupied Europe, filled a series of magnificent properties. When their daughter Edda was born, Goering reportedly commanded 500 aircraft to fly over Berlin in aerial salute. After the war, a denazification court found Emmy guilty and she was sentenced to 1 year of incarceration. After her release, 30% of her remaining wealth was confiscated and she was prohibited from performing on stage for 5 years. She eventually obtained a small apartment in Munich and wrote her autobiography. Emmy Goering passed away in Munich on June 8, 1973, at the age of 80. Now, what of the woman who was perhaps the most central female figure in the entire story of Nazi Germany? The woman who has fascinated historians and filmmakers and the general public for more than 70 years. Magda Goebbels is perhaps the most tragic and simultaneously most disturbing figure among the wives of the Nazi leadership. A woman whose story ends in an act of violence against her own children that remains almost impossible to comprehend. Born Johanna Maria Magdalena Behrendt in 1901, she went through several significant relationships before she met Joseph Goebbels, Hitler's Minister of Propaganda. Before her marriage to Goebbels, she had been married to a wealthy industrialist named Günther Quandt, with whom she had a son named Harold Quandt. Her second marriage, to Joseph Goebbels, took place in December 1931, with Adolf Hitler himself serving as a witness, an arrangement that already speaks to the extraordinary intimacy between the Goebbels family and the Führer's inner circle. Magda Goebbels was not merely the wife of a powerful Nazi, she was, in many respects, a devoted Nazi in her own right, and her connection to Hitler was personal and profound. Hitler referred to her as the ideal German woman. She and Goebbels had 6 children together, all of whose names began with the letter H, allegedly in honor of Hitler: Helga, born 1932, Hildegard, born 1934, Helmut, born 1935, Holdein, born 1937, Hedwig, born 1938, and Heidrun, born 1940. These 6 children became the public face of the ideal Nazi family, photographed and filmed endlessly as symbols of Aryan domestic virtue. By the end of the war, Joseph Goebbels had made clear that he intended to die in Berlin rather than surrender, and he brought his entire family with him into the Führer bunker in the final days of April 1945. As the Soviet army closed in on the capital, Magda Goebbels made a decision that defies every instinct of parenthood. On the night of May 1st, 1945, she and Joseph Goebbels killed all 6 of their children, sedating them and then placing cyanide capsules in their mouths. The official explanation that Magda gave in a final letter to her eldest son from her first marriage was that she could not bear to see her children live in a world without National Socialism. The children, ranging in age from 4 to 12, had been murdered by their own mother to preserve the purity of a political idea. She and Goebbels then went up to the Reich Chancellery garden where he shot her and then himself. Their bodies were partially burned by SS guards before the bunker fell to Soviet forces. It is a crime that stands alongside the worst of the war's atrocities in its sheer moral horror, and yet it was carried out by a woman who in life had been celebrated as the embodiment of German motherhood. Gerda Bormann was the wife of Martin Bormann, who served as head of the Nazi Party Chancellery and was effectively Hitler's personal secretary in the final years of the war, controlling access to the Führer and accumulating enormous behind-the-scenes power that made him, by the war's final years, one of the most influential people in Germany. Gerda Buch married Bormann in 1929 and was a committed Nazi ideologue in her own right. She shared her husband's fanatical commitment to National Socialism and was known to write enthusiastic and deeply disturbing letters to him, endorsing ideas about polygamy and the production of as many racially pure German children as possible. The couple had 10 children together, a number that reflected not simply personal desire, but also the regime's obsession with biological reproduction as a political and racial project. Martin Bormann vanished in the chaos of the final days of the war, attempting to escape Berlin as Soviet forces closed in. His fate remained a mystery for decades until DNA analysis in the 1990s confirmed that skeletal remains found in Berlin in 1972 were indeed his, establishing that he had died in May 1945, likely shortly after his attempted escape from the burning city. Gerda Bormann did not live to see any of the post-war reckoning. She had contracted cancer during the final years of the war, and the deterioration of Germany's medical infrastructure in 1944 and 1945 left her without adequate treatment. She died on March 23, 1946 in Murano, Italy, which was at that point under Allied control. She was 36 years old. The fate of her numerous children was complicated and difficult, with several of them placed in various guardianship arrangements in the chaotic aftermath of the war. Eva Braun occupies a singular position in the history of the Nazi regime. Hitler's companion for more than 12 years, she was almost entirely hidden from public view during her lifetime, and her story ended in the Berlin bunker alongside the man to whom she had devoted her adult life. Born in Munich in 1912, Eva came from a modest middle-class background and first met Hitler in the late 1920s when she was working as an assistant in the photography studio of Heinrich Hoffmann, Hitler's official photographer. Hitler was approximately 40 years old. Eva was approximately 17. Their relationship developed slowly and was kept profoundly secret from the German public, who were given no indication that their Führer had a long-term romantic partner. Eva lived at Berchtesgaden and at Hitler's private quarters, forbidden from appearing in public with him, excluded from official functions, and essentially imprisoned in luxury and secrecy that paradoxically cut her off from the normal social world. She attempted suicide twice in the early years of the relationship, once in 1932 and again in 1935, episodes that appear to reflect the enormous psychological toll of her hidden and constrained existence. Despite the secrecy, she was widely known among the inner circle, and accounts from those who knew both of them suggest she was deeply in love with Hitler. In the final days of April 1945, Eva Braun made the deliberate decision to travel to Berlin to be with Hitler in the bunker, knowing that it would almost certainly mean her death. She and Hitler were married in a civil ceremony on April 28, 1945, just hours before both of them committed suicide on April 30th. Eva Braun took cyanide. She was 33 years old, and she had spent her adult life as the secret companion of a man who had initiated a war that killed more than 70 million people. In death, as in life, she was his in a way that the rest of the world was only permitted to know after everything was already over. Annelies von Ribbentrop was the wife of Joachim von Ribbentrop, the Nazi foreign minister who played a critical diplomatic role in enabling Hitler's aggressive expansion before the outbreak of war, negotiating both the Anti-Comintern Pact and, most notoriously, the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact with the Soviet Union in August 1939, which divided Eastern Europe into German and Soviet spheres of influence and cleared the diplomatic way for the invasion of Poland that triggered the Second World War. Ribbentrop was widely regarded even within the Nazi hierarchy as arrogant, pompous, and intellectually limited, and his social pretensions were openly mocked by other senior figures, including Goering, who despised him. Annelies was the daughter of a wealthy, sparkling wine manufacturer, and the Ribbentrop family's considerable social ambitions were facilitated in part by her family money and connections. The Ribbentrops had 5 children together. After the war, Joachim von Ribbentrop was captured, tried at Nuremberg on all 4 counts of the indictment, convicted, and hanged on October 16, 1946, the first of the Nuremberg defendants to be executed. Annelies spent the rest of her life working to rehabilitate her husband's reputation. She was known to maintain contacts with former Nazi circles and to resist any acknowledgement of her husband's guilt. She even published materials arguing that Ribbentrop had been a man of peace who had done his best to prevent the very war he had helped to make possible. She died in 1973, having devoted nearly 3 decades of her post-war life to an effort that historians found both historically untenable and morally troubling. Brigitte Frank was the wife of Hans Frank, the man who served as Hitler's personal lawyer and later as Governor-General of occupied Poland, where he presided over a regime of terror and was directly complicit in the murder of the Jewish population of Polish territory under his control. Known as the Butcher of Poland, Hans Frank was tried at Nuremberg and hanged in October 1946. Brigitte had married Frank in 1925, and the couple had 5 children together. She was known to be deeply involved in the lavish social life of the government general, enjoying the wealth and status that came from her husband's position as the master of an occupied territory. After the war, Brigitte Frank sought to distance herself from the worst aspects of her husband's legacy, though the historical record of Hans Frank's role in the Holocaust made this a difficult enterprise. She outlived her husband by many decades, dying in 1959. The question of what she knew and when she knew it remained a subject of historical inquiry, particularly given that Hans Frank maintained extensive personal diaries throughout the war years, diaries that he voluntarily handed over to Allied authorities at the end of the war in what he described as a gesture of remorse, and which provided some of the most detailed documentation of his crimes available to the prosecution at Nuremberg. Henriette von Schirach was the wife of Baldur von Schirach, the head of the Hitler Youth and later the Gauleiter of Vienna. Her own father was Heinrich Hoffmann, Hitler's personal photographer, which meant that Henriette had grown up in close proximity to the Nazi leadership from a very early age. She was one of the very few women in Hitler's immediate social circle who is documented to have directly challenged the Führer over the persecution of Jews. In 1943, she reportedly told Hitler at a social gathering at Berchtesgaden that she had witnessed Jewish women in Amsterdam being rounded up and loaded onto trucks in brutal conditions, and that the sight had disturbed her deeply. Hitler reacted with fury, accusing her of sentimentality, and Henriette was subsequently excluded from his social circle entirely. This episode, which Henriette recounted in her memoirs, has sometimes been cited as evidence that even within Hitler's immediate social world, there were individuals who retained some degree of moral perception, though critics have noted that challenging Hitler privately at a dinner party while continuing to benefit from the regime's privileges was a form of moral resistance with extremely limited practical effect. Baldur von Schirach was tried at Nuremberg and convicted of crimes against humanity for his role in the deportation of Viennese Jews to the death camps in the East. He was sentenced to 20 years in prison, serving his full sentence before being released in 1966. Henriette, who had divorced him in 1949 while he was imprisoned, went on to write her memoirs, a work that offered a complicated and at times self-serving portrait of life within the Nazi inner circle. She died in 1992. What became of the women who shared their lives with the most senior figures of the Nazi naval command and the broader military leadership? Ingeborg Dönitz was the wife of Grand Admiral Karl Dönitz, the commander of the German U-boat fleet, and later the commander of the entire German Navy, and ultimately the man whom Hitler designated as his successor as head of the German state in the final days of April 1945. This made Dönitz, however briefly, the last head of state of Nazi Germany, a position he held for approximately 3 weeks before German forces surrendered unconditionally and his government was dissolved by the Allied powers. Karl Dönitz was tried at Nuremberg and convicted of war crimes related to his conduct of the submarine campaign, though the sentence he received, 10 years in prison, was significantly lighter than that given to many other defendants, in part because the Allied navies had themselves engaged in unrestricted submarine warfare, and the prosecution found it difficult to condemn German practice without implicitly criticizing Allied conduct. Dönitz served his full sentence at Spandau prison and was released in 1956. Ingeborg Dönitz remained a devoted supporter of her husband throughout his imprisonment and his release. She died in 1962, several years before her husband, who survived until 1980. The question of how much she knew about and supported the conduct of the submarine war and the broader policies of the regime to which her husband belonged remained largely unexplored in the historical literature, as was the case with many wives of senior German military officers. Nadezhda Alliluyeva holds a unique and deeply poignant position in the history of totalitarian leadership. She was the wife of Joseph Stalin, and she died in circumstances that remain genuinely disputed even after more than 90 years. Born in 1901 to a Georgian revolutionary family with strong Bolshevik credentials, Nadezhda met Stalin when she was a child, and he was an adult revolutionary hiding in her family's home. They married in 1919 when she was 17 and he was 39. And the union produced 2 children, Vasily, born 1921, and Svetlana, born 1926. Stalin also had a son, Yakov, from a previous relationship who became part of the household. The marriage appears to have been turbulent and frequently unhappy. Nadezhda was known to be intelligent, opinionated, and increasingly troubled by what she saw happening in the Soviet Union under her husband's leadership. As Stalin's power consolidated and the violence of collectivization and the early political purges began to take their terrible toll on the Soviet population, Nadezhda reportedly became increasingly distressed. She was studying at the Industrial Academy in Moscow when she died on November 9, 1932, at the age of 31. The official cause given was appendicitis. Almost immediately, those close to the situation suspected suicide, and the suicide theory has been accepted by most serious historians as the most credible explanation. Some accounts suggest she shot herself following a brutal confrontation with Stalin at a dinner party, during which he publicly humiliated her. What is known is that her death affected Stalin deeply, though his subsequent behavior, which involved the terror of the Great Purge and the deaths of millions of Soviet citizens, suggests that whatever grief he experienced did not translate into any softening of his conduct as a ruler. Rachel Mussolini, wife of Italian dictator Benito Mussolini, spent her life projecting an image of simple, earthy Italian domesticity that was in many ways a carefully constructed propaganda tool for the fascist regime. Born Rachele Guidi in 1890 in the Romagna region of Italy, she came from a humble rural background and had known Mussolini since childhood, as their fathers had been friends. They began living together in 1914, at a time when Mussolini was still a socialist agitator, and their relationship was formalized in a religious ceremony in 1925, more than a decade after they began their life together. The couple had 5 children: Edda, born 1910, Vittorio, born 1916, Bruno, born 1918, Romano, born 1927, and Anna Maria, born 1929. Mussolini had numerous extramarital relationships throughout their time together, most famously with the journalist and intellectual Margherita Sarfatti, who was Jewish, a detail that takes on additional significance given the racial laws that Mussolini's government would later introduce under pressure from Nazi Germany. Rachele was aware of these affairs and deeply resented them, though she remained committed to the marriage and to Mussolini as a political figure throughout the years of the fascist dictatorship. The collapse of Mussolini's regime came dramatically in stages. He He was overthrown by the fascist Grand Council in July 1943, arrested, and then rescued by German special forces in September 1943 to lead the puppet Italian Social Republic in the north of the country. For the final 19 months of the war, Rachel lived through this period of diminishing power and growing danger, watching Italy become a battlefield and her husband's authority reduced to little more than a German-endorsed fiction. The final catastrophe came on April 28, 1945, when Benito Mussolini was captured by Italian communist partisans while attempting to flee to Switzerland in a German military column. He was executed along with his mistress, Clara Petacci, and their bodies were taken to Milan and hung upside down from the roof of a petrol station at the Piazzale Loreto, where crowds subjected them to savage public desecration. It was a brutal end for a man who had once commanded one of Europe's major powers, and the manner of his death reflected the depth of the accumulated rage of a population that had suffered under his rule for over 2 decades. Rachel was not with him when he was captured. She was eventually detained by Allied forces and subjected to questioning, but was released and allowed to live relatively quietly. She spent much of her later life near Predappio, Mussolini's birthplace, where his tomb became a site of pilgrimage for Italian neo-fascists, a development she neither encouraged nor was able to prevent. She wrote 2 books about her life with Mussolini, consistently presenting herself as a devoted wife rather than a political supporter, and she died on October 30th, 1979, at the age of 89. Carmen Polo was the wife of Francisco Franco, the Spanish nationalist general who overthrew the elected Republican government in the Spanish Civil War and ruled Spain as an absolute dictator from 1939 until his death in 1975. Where Rachele Mussolini had projected an image of rural simplicity, Carmen Polo cultivated a persona of aristocratic Catholic piety that aligned perfectly with the reactionary social vision of the Francoist state. She was born in 1900 into an upper-middle-class family in Oviedo and married Franco in 1923, before he had achieved the political prominence that would define his historical legacy. Their only child, Maria del Carmen Franco Polo, was born in 1926. Carmen Polo was not simply a domestic figure during the Franco years. She wielded considerable influence at court, was known to intervene in political and ecclesiastical appointments, and enjoyed a lifestyle of luxury that contrasted sharply with the poverty experienced by many Spanish people in the early, harshly repressive decades of the dictatorship. She was given the honorific Señora de Méritos, a recognition of her quasi-official status as Spain's First Lady. Following Franco's death in November 1975 and the subsequent democratic transition overseen by King Juan Carlos I, Carmen Polo retreated entirely from public life. She died in Madrid on February 6, 1988, at the age of 87. Throughout her long post-war life, she never publicly acknowledged the scale of the political violence that had characterized the early years of the Francoist regime, when tens of thousands of Republicans and political opponents were executed in mass killings that historians have increasingly recognized as crimes against humanity. Elena Ceausescu was a figure who transcended the typical role of a dictator's wife to become one of the most powerful individuals in Romanian communist history, though her claim to many of her positions rested in part on academic credentials that were widely believed to be fabricated or massively inflated. As the wife of Nicolae Ceausescu, the Romanian communist dictator who ruled the country from 1965 until the revolution of December 1989, Elena exercised power that went far beyond any advisory or ceremonial function. She held the title of First Deputy Prime Minister, served on the Political Executive Committee's Permanent Bureau, and was deeply involved in the machinery of state. She was awarded multiple honorary doctorates from universities around the world during the 1970s, when the Ceausescu regime was viewed more favorably by Western governments as an independent voice within the Warsaw Pact. Romanian scientists who worked in her name were privately unanimous in their assessment that her claimed expertise in chemistry was essentially fabricated, with actual scientific work performed by others while she received the credit. The Romanian Revolution of December 1989 was the most violent of the transitions that ended communist rule in Eastern Europe that year. The Ceausescus fled Bucharest by helicopter on December 22, 1989, but were quickly captured by military forces loyal to the Revolutionary Council. On December 25th, Christmas Day, they were subjected to a hasty summary trial lasting approximately 2 hours. Both Elena and Nicolae Ceausescu were convicted of genocide, undermining the national economy and destroying state power, and both were sentenced to death. They were executed by firing squad that same afternoon. Elena Ceausescu reportedly cursed and struggled until the very last moment. She and her husband were 69 and 71 years old, respectively. Their execution was filmed and the footage was broadcast on Romanian television shortly afterward, viewed by millions of Romanians who had suffered under the regime. They were the only Eastern European communist leaders to be executed rather than peacefully deposed during the events of 1989. And the manner of their deaths reflected both the genuine rage of a population that had endured particular hardship under their rule and the revolutionary urgency of a political situation in which a trial of more conventional length would have presented serious risks. Jiang Qing occupies a singular and deeply controversial position in the history of 20th century China. She was the fourth wife of Mao Zedong, the founder of the People's Republic of China, and in the last decade of his life she became one of the most powerful political figures in the country. Born in 1914 in Shandong province, she had a career as an actress in Shanghai before joining the Communist Party and eventually attracting Mao's romantic interest. Their marriage in 1938 was controversial within the party leadership, and Mao was reportedly required to agree to restrictions on her political activities as a condition of the leadership's grudging acceptance. For roughly 2 decades, she remained largely in the background of Chinese political life, but from 1966 onward, she became a central figure in the Cultural Revolution, the campaign of mass political violence that Mao launched that year and that ultimately led to the deaths of between 500,000 and 2 million people, with millions more imprisoned in labor camps or subjected to violent public humiliation. Jiang Qing was one of the principal directors of this campaign, using her position to settle personal scores, eliminate perceived enemies, and impose suffocating ideological conformity on Chinese culture and education. Following Mao's death in September 1976, she and 3 other radical leaders, the Gang of Four, were arrested just over a month later. She was tried in 1980 and 1981, convicted and sentenced to death, a sentence commuted to life imprisonment. She remained defiant throughout her trial, refusing remorse and insisting she had only been carrying out Mao's will. Released from prison in 1991 on health grounds and placed under house arrest, she died on May 14, 1991, officially of suicide by hanging. She was 77 years old. Now we must turn fully to the children, those who had no say in the circumstances of their birth, who grew up inside a reality constructed entirely by their parents' choices, and who were left to navigate the moral wreckage of those choices for the remainder of their lives. Their responses to that impossible inheritance were as varied as human nature itself, and taken together they form one of the most extraordinary collections of individual moral biographies in modern history. Gudrun Himmler was born on August 8, 1929, the only biological daughter of Heinrich Himmler, the most powerful man in the SS and one of the central architects of the Holocaust. She was, by all accounts, the great love of her father's life, and the relationship between them was one of unusual warmth given the monstrous nature of Himmler's public activities. He arranged to have her flown from Munich, where she lived with her mother, to his offices in Berlin, whenever possible. He made daily phone calls to her when they were apart, sent weekly letters, and referred to her by her childhood nickname, Puppy, a term of endearment that he maintained even as he was overseeing an apparatus of mass murder on a previously unimagined scale. There is something deliberately disturbing about this juxtaposition. The man who gave orders for the operation of Auschwitz, Treblinka, and Sobibor was simultaneously a devoted father who used a pet name for his daughter and wrote her affectionate weekly letters about domestic topics. The psychological division required to maintain both realities simultaneously without apparent contradiction was extraordinary. Gudrun Himmler spent her entire adult life as one of the most unyielding defenders of her father's legacy. Following World War II, both she and her mother Margaret were apprehended by American forces and held in a series of detention camps in Italy, France, and Germany. They were summoned to Nuremberg to provide testimony at the trials of other senior Nazi figures and were eventually released in November 1946. For many children of perpetrators, the experience of the immediate post-war period served as a catalyst for confronting the truth of what their parents had done. Not so for Gudrun. She contested the widely accepted account of her father's death, insisting that he had not committed suicide by biting a cyanide capsule, but had instead been assassinated by his British captors, a claim for which no credible evidence has ever been produced. She became deeply involved with the Stille Hilfe, or Silent Aid, a secretive organisation that functioned as a support network for former SS members who were imprisoned, condemned, or in hiding. Through Stille Hilfe, Gudrun worked tirelessly to provide practical and moral support to individuals convicted of some of the worst war crimes in human history, visiting them in prison, arranging legal assistance, and maintaining networks of mutual support among former SS families. German investigative journalists over the decades consistently identified her as an important figure within networks connected to post-war neo-Nazism, though she consistently denied that her activities had any political dimension beyond personal loyalty to individuals she believed had been unjustly treated. Gudrun Himmler died in May 2018 at the age of 88, never having publicly acknowledged the crimes of which her father was the principal organizer and having spent her entire post-war life working in practical terms against the cause of justice for the Holocaust's victims. Martin Bormann Jr. was the eldest son of Martin Bormann, the head of the Nazi Party Chancellery, and one of the most powerful men in Hitler's Germany during the final years of the war. Born on April 14, 1930, he was a child of 14 when the war ended, old enough to have been formed by the world of the Third Reich, but young enough to have been shielded from its most explicit horrors. Growing up in the household of a man who was at the centre of Hitler's inner circle, young Martin Bormann Jr.'s childhood was extraordinary by any measure. He had been baptized by Hitler's personal adjutant and moved in a world of uniforms, rallies, and ideological certainty. After the war, as the full scale of the Nazi regime's crimes became undeniable, Martin Bormann Jr. underwent one of the most dramatic moral transformations documented among the children of senior Nazis. He converted to Catholicism and eventually became a Catholic priest, devoting his life to work in the mission fields of Central Africa, including postings in Congo and Cameroon. He worked with communities that were among the most marginalized people on Earth, in what he acknowledged was at least in part an attempt to make some form of restitution for his father's misdeeds. His was not simply a private spiritual conversion, but a genuinely public act of identification with those whom the Nazi regime had sought to dominate and destroy. Bormann Jr.'s story is not without its own dark complications. In 2011, he found himself at the centre of serious abuse allegations when a former student claimed that Bormann had physically abused him in the early 1960s, during Bormann's years as a teacher in Austria. While the allegations never led to formal criminal charges, the independent Klasnik Commission, established to investigate abuses within the Catholic Church in Austria, awarded financial compensation to the accuser. Martin Bormann Jr. died in 2009 before the full extent of these allegations had been publicly aired, having lived a life that combined genuine moral seriousness about his father's crimes with his own unresolved shadows. Nicholas Frank is one of the most extraordinary figures among the children of Nazi perpetrators, precisely because of the radical and deeply personal way in which he has chosen to confront his father's legacy. Born in 1939, the son of Hans Frank, who served as Hitler's personal lawyer and later as Governor-General of occupied Poland, Nicholas was an infant when his father was wielding the power of life and death over millions of people under his administration. Hans Frank, known as the Butcher of Poland, oversaw a regime of extraordinary violence and exploitation in occupied Polish territory. He was tried at Nuremberg, convicted, and hanged on October 16, 1946. Nicholas Frank was 7 years old when his father was executed. Most children in that situation, confronted with the overwhelming shame and horror of what their parent had done, have chosen some form of protective silence or selective denial. Nicholas Frank took the opposite path. He has spent his adult life not defending his father, but actively and publicly denouncing him in the harshest possible terms. He wrote a book in the 1980s titled In the Shadow of the Reich, published in German as Der Vater, in which he confronted his father's crimes with a brutality of language that shocked many readers. The book was not a measured historical analysis, but a raw, visceral, personal reckoning. He subsequently wrote similarly unsparing books about his mother and about his brother Norman, who, unlike Nicholas, defended their father's memory. Nicholas Frank has lectured extensively in Germany and beyond about the Holocaust and about the personal consequences of growing up as the child of a perpetrator. He has become one of the most prominent voices among the children of Nazi war criminals who have chosen public engagement with history rather than private silence, and his willingness to condemn his own father in the most unequivocal terms has made him a deeply valuable figure in Holocaust education and remembrance. Edda Goering was the only child of Hermann Goering and his second wife, Emmy Zonnemann. Born just before the outbreak of World War II, Edda spent her early years at Karinhall, the Goering's magnificent estate north of Berlin, filled with stolen art and furnished with an extravagance that Goering made no effort to conceal. Edda's early childhood was one of extraordinary privilege. She received gifts of irreplaceable historical artworks, including a painting by Lucas Cranach the Elder, a gift that had in all probability been stolen from a Jewish family or confiscated from a museum in occupied Europe. As the war turned against Germany, she and her mother relocated to their mountain residence near Berchtesgaden, where they were eventually captured by Allied forces. Hermann Goering was tried at Nuremberg, convicted, and sentenced to death, escaping the gallows by suicide on the eve of his execution. Edda Goering chose a life of maximum privacy in the post-war decades. She rarely spoke about her father in public settings, though in private conversations she consistently maintained that he had been a good man, a characterization that the historical record makes extremely difficult to sustain. The valuable artworks and gifts she had received as a child became the subjects of prolonged and complex legal disputes, most of which she lost in proceedings that concluded in 1968. A Swedish television interview in 1986, in which she broke her characteristic silence to express deep affection for both of her parents, generated considerable attention and criticism. She passed away in December 2018 at the age of 80, having lived for more than 7 decades in the shadow of her father's conviction for crimes against humanity. Rolf Mengele was born on March 16, 1944, the son of Josef Mengele, the SS physician at Auschwitz concentration camp who conducted barbaric pseudo-scientific experiments on prisoners, particularly children and twins. Known as the Angel of Death, Josef Mengele personally selected arriving prisoners for death in the gas chambers or for his experiments, wielding absolute power over the lives of hundreds of thousands of people. Rolf Mengele's early life was separated from the horrors his father was perpetrating in Poland. He was raised in post-war Germany, protected from the truth of his father's activities by a web of family deception. For much of his childhood, he was led to believe his father had been a war hero, a comforting fiction maintained by surviving family members. It was only as a teenager that Rolf began to discover the chilling reality of what Josef Mengele had actually done. After the war, Josef Mengele had fled to South America, settling in Paraguay and later Brazil, where he lived under various assumed identities while being actively sought by Nazi hunters and West German authorities. Josef Mengele wrote letters to Rolf, however, and these letters sparked a curiosity that eventually led Rolf to make a remarkable journey to South America in 1977 to meet his father in person. Rolf later described how his father displayed no guilt whatsoever for the atrocities he had committed at Auschwitz, and actually attempted to rationalize and justify the experiments. Rolf felt both revulsion at his father's absence of remorse and, simultaneously, found himself unable to betray the man to the authorities. He kept Josef Mengele's South American locations secret. Josef Mengele died of a stroke while swimming at Bertioga, Brazil, on February 7, 1979, drowning before anyone could pull him from the water. His death went unannounced for years, with his remains only identified in 1985 and confirmed by DNA analysis in 1992. Rolf Mengele subsequently changed his name and sought to disappear from public attention, believed to have retired from his career as a corporate lawyer to live quietly in Germany, never charged with any crime despite his silence about his father's whereabouts in the years when that silence allowed the most wanted Nazi war criminal in the world to die, unpunished. Wolf Rudiger Hess was born in 1937, the only child of Rudolf Hess, whose godfather was Adolf Hitler. His father flew to Scotland in 1941, was captured, served as a defendant at Nuremberg, and was then imprisoned for the remaining 46 years of his life in Spandau prison. Wolf Hess visited his imprisoned father regularly during his teenage years, and those visits formed a profound emotional bond that would define the rest of his life. During the 1950s, Wolf Hess established a political organization called the Committee to Free Rudolf Hess, which eventually amassed several 100,000 supporters. He authored numerous books arguing that his father was not a war criminal, but a man who had acted from genuine patriotism and deserved recognition as a German hero. When Rudolf Hess was found hanged in his cell at Spandau on August 17, 1987, at the age of 93 in what was officially ruled a suicide, Wolf refused to accept that verdict. He maintained until his own death that his father had been murdered by British intelligence. No credible evidence has ever supported the murder theory. Wolf Hess died in 2001, having spent more than half a century defending a man whose flight to Scotland remains one of the most baffling individual acts of the entire Second World War. Albert Speer Jr. was born on July 29, 1934, in Berlin, just days before Adolf Hitler formally assumed the title of Führer. There are films from the 1930s that show a young Albert Speer Jr. playing on the porch of Hitler's villa at Berchtesgaden under the dictator's watchful gaze, images that serve as a visual reminder of how intimately connected the personal lives of senior Nazis were with the highest levels of the regime. His father, Albert Speer Sr., served as Hitler's personal architect and later as Germany's Minister of Armaments and War Production, proving enormously effective at sustaining German industrial output through the extensive use of forced labour. When Speer Sr. was convicted at Nuremberg and sentenced to 20 years in prison, Albert Jr. and his siblings took refuge with their grandparents in Heidelberg. The adjustment was profoundly difficult. Albert Jr. developed a severe stutter during this period, which he eventually managed to overcome. He initially trained as a carpenter before redirecting his focus to architecture. He was adamant that his career choice was not influenced by his father's example. In a 2010 interview with the Süddeutsche Zeitung, Albert Speer Jr. explicitly refrained from discussing his father, who had died in 1981. He distanced himself emphatically from the paternal connection, stating directly that he had tried his whole life to separate himself from his father, to establish his own identity and professional reputation entirely independently of the infamous name he bore. Albert Speer Jr. went on to build a successful international career as an architect and urban planner, with major projects across the Middle East and Asia. He passed away at his Frankfurt residence on September 15, 2017, at the age of 83. The six Goebbels children never had the opportunity to grapple with their father's legacy or to choose their own response to history, because their mother took that choice away from them in the Berlin bunker on the night of May 1, 1945. Helga Susanne Goebbels was 12 years old, Hildegard was 11, Helmut was 10, Holdine was 8, Hedwig was 6, and Heidrun was 4 years old. These six children were murdered by their own mother, sedated with morphine, and then killed with cyanide capsules placed in their mouths, in what Magda Goebbels described in her final letter as an act of maternal mercy. The children are buried at the Ludwigslust Palace Park in northern Germany, where their bodies were discovered by Soviet forces in early May 1945. Magda's eldest son from her first marriage, Harold Quandt, was the only one of her children to survive the war. He had been serving as a Luftwaffe pilot and was a prisoner of war when his 6 half-siblings were murdered. He was deeply traumatized by the deaths and spent little of his subsequent life speaking publicly about his family's history. Harold Quandt went on to inherit a substantial portion of the Quandt family's industrial fortune and became a significant figure in West German business before his death in a plane crash in 1967. The Quandt family themselves faced considerable historical scrutiny in later decades regarding their use of forced labor during the Nazi period, underscoring how broadly the moral contamination of the regime extended through German society. Yakov Djugashvili was Joseph Stalin's eldest son, born from Stalin's first marriage to Kato Svanidze, who died of typhus in 1907 when Yakov was only an infant. He was raised largely by his maternal relatives in Georgia and had a difficult and emotionally complicated relationship with his father, who was often distant, critical, and emotionally cold toward him. By the time Stalin had consolidated power in the Soviet Union, Yakov was a young man attempting to find his place in a country where his father's name could open any door but also brought enormous pressure and scrutiny. He eventually joined the Red Army and was serving as an artillery officer when Germany invaded the Soviet Union in June 1941. In the catastrophic early weeks of the invasion, when Soviet forces suffered defeats of almost incomprehensible scale, Yakov Djugashvili was captured by German forces in July 1941. His capture placed Stalin in an extraordinarily difficult personal and political position. The Germans were aware of who they had captured and attempted to use Yakov as a propaganda tool, distributing leaflets with his photograph and claims that he had willingly surrendered, which was almost certainly false. They also attempted to negotiate an exchange of Yakov for Field Marshal Friedrich Paulus, who had surrendered to Soviet forces at Stalingrad in February 1943. Stalin famously refused, reportedly saying words to the effect that he did not trade a marshal for a soldier. The truth of exactly what Stalin said and felt about his son's captivity has been debated by historians, with some suggesting genuine indifference and others suggesting a more complex response constrained by the political impossibility of appearing to show favoritism. Yakov Djugashvili died on April 14, 1943, at the Sachsenhausen concentration camp near Berlin, in circumstances that remain somewhat uncertain. The most widely accepted account holds that he deliberately threw himself onto the electrified perimeter fence after being refused permission to enter his prison barracks, which would make his death a suicide. He was 35 years old. He left behind a wife, Julia, and a daughter named Galina, whom Stalin subsequently had arrested and imprisoned, though she was released after his death. Svetlana Alliluyeva, born in 1926 as the only daughter of Joseph Stalin, lived one of the most extraordinary lives of any child born into the shadow of a 20th century dictator, and her eventual response to her father's legacy was the most dramatic possible. She defected to the West. Growing up in the Kremlin, she was in many respects the apple of her father's eye during her childhood, though Stalin's affections were always conditional, and his treatment of those closest to him was deeply unpredictable. Her mother, Nadezhda, died in 1932 when Svetlana was 6 years old. She grew up surrounded by privilege and constant surveillance, educated in the finest Soviet institutions but never free from the awareness of who her father was and what that meant for every relationship in her life. Stalin intervened directly in her romantic life, once ordering the deportation of a man she loved because he was Jewish. After Stalin's death in March 1953, Svetlana underwent a long and complex process of ideological re-evaluation. She converted to Christianity, and she became increasingly alienated from the Soviet system her father had built. The breaking point came in 1967 when she travelled to India to scatter the ashes of a friend and did not return. On March 6, 1967, Svetlana Alliluyeva walked into the American embassy in New Delhi and requested asylum, delivering one of the most sensational defections of the Cold War era. She was brought to the United States, where she wrote her memoirs and became a celebrated symbol of the individual's capacity to escape even the most totalizing political systems. Her books, 20 Letters to a Friend and Only 1 Year, were bestsellers in the West. She became an American citizen, had a daughter, and tried to build a new life. She eventually returned to the Soviet Union briefly in 1984 before leaving again, spending her final years in various locations. She died in Richland County, Wisconsin, on November 22, 2011, at the age of 85, one of the very few children of a major 20th century dictator who publicly and unequivocally condemned her father's crimes and sought to build an entirely independent life on her own terms. Vasily Stalin, Svetlana's older brother, lived a life that stands in nearly complete contrast to his sister's trajectory. Born in 1921, Vasily was raised with enormous privilege and developed serious difficulties with alcohol and discipline from relatively early in his life. He pursued a military career, rising rapidly through the ranks of the Soviet Air Force in a progression that had everything to do with his surname and relatively little to do with his actual capabilities. He reached the rank of Colonel General and commanded the Soviet Air Force of the Moscow Military District, a position of enormous prestige from which he proceeded to exercise his authority with recklessness and impunity. He was known to cover up evidence of accidents caused by negligence and to preside over training standards that left much to be desired. His position as the dictator's son made him nearly untouchable during Stalin's lifetime. Following Stalin's death in March 1953, Vasily was rapidly stripped of his rank and privileges. He was arrested and charged with corruption, misappropriation of state funds, and abuse of power, charges that were credible given his behavior during his years of command. He was sentenced to 8 years in prison. He was released in 1960 but continued to struggle with alcoholism and repeatedly clashed with Soviet authorities. Vasily Stalin died on March 19, 1962, in Kazan, at the age of 40, his health destroyed by decades of heavy drinking and the physical and psychological consequences of his imprisonment. He died a man who had squandered every advantage his famous name had given him and had added nothing of substance to the world his father, for all his crimes, had at least built according to some coherent vision. Romano Mussolini, the youngest son of Benito Mussolini to survive the war, chose a path of relative normalcy and genuine artistic achievement that stood in deliberate contrast to the tumultuous political legacy of his family. Born in 1927, Romano was 17 years old when Italian partisans shot his father and hung the body in Milan's Piazzale Loreto. He was young enough that his primary memories of his father were personal rather than political, and he chose to pursue a career in jazz, becoming a genuinely respected jazz pianist in post-war Italy who performed and recorded with some of the leading figures of the international jazz scene. His professional life as a musician gave him an identity that was authentically his own, separate from the Mussolini name, and he earned critical recognition on the basis of his talent. He married Maria Ciccoloni, who was the sister of the celebrated Italian actress Sophia Loren, creating a family connection to one of the most beloved figures in Italian cultural life. Romano Mussolini discussed his father in interviews primarily in personal terms, emphasizing childhood memories and family relationships rather than engaging with the political history in any systematic critical fashion. He died in Rome on February 3, 2006, at the age of 78, having built a life and a professional reputation that stood genuinely on its own merits, rather than on the shadow of his father's name. Edda Mussolini Ciano was Benito Mussolini's eldest child and arguably the family member most directly entangled in the regime's final catastrophe. Born in 1910, she was the wife of Count Galeazzo Ciano, who served as Italy's foreign minister and was one of the most prominent figures in the fascist government. Ciano was also one of the members of the fascist Grand Council who voted to remove Mussolini from power in July 1943, a vote that Mussolini experienced as a personal betrayal by his own son-in-law. When Germany rescued Mussolini and installed him as puppet leader of the Italian Social Republic, Ciano was tried by a fascist court for treason and executed by firing squad in January 1944. Edda had tried desperately to save her husband's life, engaging in a remarkable and ultimately unsuccessful diplomatic campaign that involved attempting to use her husband's private diaries as bargaining chips, smuggling them to Switzerland in the hope of exchanging them for clemency. The diaries survived and were eventually published, providing valuable historical evidence about the fascist government's inner workings. They did not save Ciano's life. Edda Mussolini lived in Rome after the war, largely withdrawn from public life, defined by the twin losses of her father, executed by partisans, and her husband, executed by the regime her father had built. She died in April 1995. The children of Kim Il-sung, the founder and absolute ruler of North Korea, represent perhaps the most extreme example of how the dynamics of totalitarian power can shape and distort the next generation. Kim Jong-il, who succeeded his father as leader of North Korea following Kim Il-sung's death in 1994, was born in 1941, and unlike most children of dictators who face some kind of post-war reckoning, Kim Jong-il faced no such reckoning at all. He was instead groomed from early adulthood to succeed his father, becoming ever more powerful within the Korean Workers' Party during the 1970s, and eventually being publicly designated as successor in the late 1970s and 1980s. When he assumed power in 1994, he continued and in some respects intensified the policies of his father, presiding over a famine in the mid-1990s that killed hundreds of thousands to potentially over 1 million North Korean citizens, while the regime maintained its massive military expenditure and the privileges of the elite class. Kim Jong-il pursued a nuclear weapons program in defiance of international pressure, testing nuclear devices in 2006 and 2009 and securing North Korea's status as a nuclear-armed state. He died in December 2011 and was in turn succeeded by his own son, Kim Jong-un, creating a third-generation hereditary dictatorship that remains in power to the present day, making North Korea one of the most extreme cases in history of totalitarian power, successfully passing through multiple generations of a single family. The the children of Pol Pot, the leader of the Khmer Rouge who oversaw the Cambodian genocide of 1975 to 1979, in which between 1.5 and 2 million people died, representing roughly a quarter of Cambodia's entire population, represent a story of deliberate obscurity rather than public engagement with legacy. Pol Pot himself lived in hiding in Thailand and along the Thai-Cambodian border after the Vietnamese invasion, overthrew his regime in January 1979, and he continued to lead a diminished Khmer Rouge movement for nearly 2 decades before dying under house arrest by his own former comrades in April 1998. His daughter Mayas Muth, his only child from his second marriage to Maya Son, grew up in the jungle with her parents during the years of Khmer Rouge guerrilla activity, an upbringing about as far removed from normal childhood development as it is possible to imagine. The broader question of accountability for the children of the Khmer Rouge leadership is still being addressed through the extraordinary chambers in the courts of Cambodia, which has conducted trials of surviving senior Khmer Rouge leaders for crimes against humanity and genocide. The children of these leaders have mostly chosen lives of deliberate privacy, and the subject of how the next generation has processed the legacy of the genocide remains a sensitive and ongoing dimension of Cambodian society's broader reckoning with its traumatic recent history. Idi Amin Dada, the military dictator of Uganda from 1971 to 1979, whose regime was responsible for the deaths of between 100,000 and 500,000 Ugandans through state-sponsored violence, torture, and extrajudicial killing, had a personal life of extraordinary complexity. He was married at various points to at least 6 women, both officially and unofficially, and fathered a large number of children, estimates ranging from 30 to 60, though precise numbers are difficult to establish given the nature of his various relationships. When Amin's regime was overthrown by Tanzanian military forces and Ugandan exiles in April 1979, he fled the country, living first in Libya, then in Iraq, and eventually settling permanently in Saudi Arabia, where he was given asylum and a comfortable monthly stipend by the Saudi government in exchange for maintaining a low public profile. He remained in Saudi Arabia until his death in Jeddah on August 16, 2003, having never faced trial for the atrocities committed by his regime. Several of his sons have lived in various countries, some in relative obscurity, and some making occasional attempts to comment publicly on their father's legacy, generally in terms that acknowledge his crimes but also attempt to complicate or humanize the portrait of a man who is rightly remembered as one of Africa's most brutal post-colonial dictators. The absence of any formal accountability for Amin's crimes and the comfortable asylum provided by Saudi Arabia for the final decades of his life remains a source of deep frustration for the families of his regime's victims. The Goebbels children's complete and total destruction stands as the most extreme statement about the relationship between ideology and family among all the figures we have discussed. But there is another dimension of the story of Nazi families and children that deserves attention, and that is the broader fate of the German family writ large. The Nazi regime had been obsessed with the family as a biological and racial unit, promoting birth rates, discouraging mixed relationships, and building an entire mythology around the German mother and her role in producing the next generation of racially pure Germans. The collapse of that regime left millions of families fractured by death, displacement, capture, and shame. The wives and children of ordinary SS members, of ordinary Wehrmacht soldiers, of ordinary party functionaries, all faced versions of the same reckoning that confronted the families of the most prominent leaders, scaled down but no less personally devastating. The denazification process as applied to families was broadly inconsistent, often superficial, and frequently captured by the same networks of post-war mutual protection that helped more senior figures escape consequence. The result was that German society in the 1950s contained an enormous number of individuals who had been deeply complicit in the Nazi project and who were now quietly rebuilding their lives within the new democratic federal republic, carrying their experiences and their silences with them into the institutions, professions, and social networks of the post-war world. The historiography of the perpetrators and their families has changed enormously since the immediate post-war decades. The first generation of Holocaust scholarship focused primarily on the victims, on documenting the scale and mechanism of the genocide and ensuring that the voices of survivors were recorded. From the 1960s onward, and particularly from the 1970s and 1980s, the field expanded to include much more intensive study of the perpetrators themselves. asking not just what they did, but who they were and how ordinary people were able to participate in extraordinary evil. The publication of Hannah Arendt's account of the Eichmann trial in 1963, with its controversial concept of the banality of evil, opened a new dimension of scholarly inquiry. Christopher Browning's work on Reserve Police Battalion 101, published in 1992, and Daniel Goldhagen's very different interpretation of the same evidence in Hitler's Willing Executioners in 1996, continued to deepen the debate. And within this expanding scholarly conversation, the question of the families of perpetrators has become increasingly central. How did the wives of senior Nazis understand and relate to what their husbands were doing? What did the children know? What responsibility, if any, extends to those who shared a household with perpetrators without themselves committing crimes? These are not simply historical questions, but philosophical and legal ones, and they remain unresolved in ways that continue to generate productive, scholarly, and public discussion. One of the most significant recent contributions to understanding the wives of the Nazi leadership is the work of scholars who have gone back to the documentary record, including private correspondence, diaries, and denazification files, to reconstruct in much greater detail the actual knowledge and attitudes of these women. What this research has generally shown is that the picture of the Nazi wife as an innocent, domestically confined figure, ignorant of the true nature of the regime, was largely a post-war construction designed to protect women from legal accountability. Many of these women were ideologically committed members of the Nazi movement in their own right. Many travelled to occupied territories and documented what they saw in terms that made clear they understood something of what was happening there. Many received material benefits, particularly stolen property, artwork, and forced labour services, that directly connected their daily lives to the crimes of the regime. The legal consequences they faced were, with very few exceptions, drastically disproportionate to the degree of their involvement, a disparity that reflects both the broader limitations of the denazification process and the particular vulnerability of women's complicity to being minimised or overlooked in legal frameworks that emphasised formal authority and command responsibility. What all of these stories share is the fundamental truth that crimes of the scale committed by the Nazi regime and by totalitarian governments across the 20th century do not end when the regime ends. They continue to reverberate through families, through generations, through the lives of people who bear the names of perpetrators, and must decide again and again what to do with those names. The wives of the Nazi leadership, by and large, faced far less formal accountability than their husbands. A few weeks of penal labour, some restrictions on civic rights, the confiscation of a portion of wealth. These were the consequences visited upon women who had lived inside the inner circle of history's most criminal regime. The children, confronted with the same question in their own ways and in their own times, gave answers that ranged from the extraordinary moral courage of Nicholas Frank to the extraordinary moral failure of Gudrun Himmler, with every shade of human complexity in between. The history of what happened to these families is not a comfortable history, and it was never meant to be. But it is an essential one because it reminds us that evil on the scale of the Holocaust or the Cultural Revolution is never simply the product of one monstrous individual, as it is built and sustained and enabled by networks of human beings, including the people who loved the perpetrators, who raised their children, who ran their households, and who shared their beds. Understanding what became of those people is part of understanding how these crimes were possible in the first place, and why the work of memory and accountability must never be allowed to end. Well, that's it. Thank you so much for watching, and we genuinely hope you found this video as illuminating as it was sobering. The fates of these women and children reveal dimensions of history that go far beyond the famous names and the famous crimes, and exploring these stories gives us a more complete and more honest picture of what the regimes of the 20th century actually meant for the people who lived closest to their centres of power. Some chose complicity and lifelong denial. Some chose silence and withdrawal. Some chose genuine repentance and public engagement with the cause of historical truth. And some, like the 6 Goebbels children, had no choices at all. If you found this video informative and thought-provoking, make sure to check out our other deep dives into the untold stories of World War II and the broader history of totalitarianism. We cover everything from the fates of field marshals and generals to the post-war trajectories of entire military organizations, and there is always more to explore. Don't forget to like this video, subscribe to our channel, and hit the notification bell so you never miss a new upload from us. We put enormous care and research into every video we make, and your support through likes and subscriptions is what makes it possible to keep doing this work. Thanks for being part of this community, and we will see you in the next one. The story of the Ribbentrop children offers a window into how post-war West German society navigated the impossible question of what to do with the sons and daughters of men who had been hanged as war criminals. Joachim von Ribbentrop had 5 children with Annelies: Bettina, Rudolf, Ursula, Barthold Henning, and Adolf Joachim. The youngest, Adolf Joachim, had been born in 1935, making him only 11 years old when his father was executed at Nuremberg on October 16, 1946. The children were thus left to construct their adult identities in the Federal Republic of Germany at a time when the country was simultaneously conducting one of the most thoroughgoing official denazifications in history and quietly allowing former Nazis to reintegrate into professional and social life at every level of society, from the judiciary to the diplomatic service to the academy. Barthold Henning von Ribbentrop, who went on to become a lawyer, became known for assisting his mother in her efforts to rehabilitate his father's reputation and wrote about the Ribbentrop family's experiences in ways that attracted criticism from historians who found his assessments of his father's culpability inadequate. The children of Joachim von Ribbentrop illustrate a common pattern among the families of senior Nazi war criminals in West Germany: a private loyalty to the paternal memory that coexisted, sometimes uneasily, with the formal requirements of life in a democratic state that had officially renounced the ideology their fathers had served. The question of what happened to the wives of the men who were executed at Nuremberg on October 16, 1946, is one that deserves specific attention, because those 10 men represented the very top tier of the Nazi leadership, and their wives faced a particular form of bereavement that combined the ordinary grief of losing a husband with the extraordinary circumstances of that loss being a public execution carried out by an international court. The men hanged at Nuremberg that night were Joachim von Ribbentrop, Field Marshal Wilhelm Keitel, Ernst Kaltenbrunner, Alfred Rosenberg, Hans Frank, Wilhelm Frick, Julius Streicher, Fritz Sauckel, Alfred Jodl, and Arthur Seyss-Inquart. Hermann Göring escaped execution by suicide the night before. Each of these men had a wife, and several had children, and the fates of those families illustrate just how varied the post-war experiences of Nazi-adjacent families could be. Lisa Streicher, the wife of Julius Streicher, occupied one of the most difficult positions among all the wives of senior Nazis, because her husband was arguably the most explicitly and virulently anti-Semitic of all the senior figures in the Nazi movement, having founded and edited Der Stürmer, the notoriously vicious anti-Semitic newspaper that served as one of the primary vehicles for the regime's eliminationist propaganda from 1923 onward. Streicher's publication went beyond standard Nazi anti-Semitism into pornographic and degrading imagery of Jewish people that shocked even some of his fellow Nazis, and he was tried at Nuremberg not for direct involvement in the organization of the Holocaust, but for incitement through his writings and public speeches. He was convicted on the count of crimes against humanity and hanged on October 16, 1946. His wife, Lisa Streicher, spent her post-war years attempting to maintain a dignified private existence, but the indelible association of the Streicher name with the most dehumanizing anti-Semitic propaganda ever produced made this extremely difficult. She died in obscurity, and the Streicher family's post-war story is one of almost total social marginalization, even within the networks of former Nazis who maintained mutual support systems in the early Federal Republic. Alfred Rosenberg had been one of the chief ideological theorists of the Nazi movement, having written The Myth of the 20th Century, a tedious and barely coherent work of racial pseudo-philosophy that Hitler reportedly found difficult to read but which carried enormous symbolic weight within the party as a statement of the ideological foundations of National Socialism. Rosenberg also served as Reich Minister for the occupied Eastern Territories from 1941 onward, making him directly responsible for the administration of the territories in which the Holocaust was most intensively carried out. He was tried at Nuremberg, convicted on all 4 counts of the indictment, and hanged. His wife, Hedwig Rosenberg, survived him by many years. She faced the typical combination of formal denazification proceedings and social difficulties that came with being so closely associated with one of the most comprehensively condemned figures in the history of German intellectual life. The Rosenberg case is interesting in part because of the enormous collection of looted art and cultural property that had been assembled under his authority through the Einsatzstab Reichsleiter Rosenberg, a special task force that had systematically plundered the cultural heritage of occupied Europe, particularly Jewish collections, during the war. The question of what happened to those cultural treasures and the ongoing efforts by families of the original owners to recover them continued to be a significant legal and moral issue well into the 21st century, long after both Alfred Rosenberg and his wife had died. The wife of Field Marshal Wilhelm Keitel, who served as the head of the German Armed Forces High Command and was one of the senior military figures tried at Nuremberg, faced the challenge of reconciling her husband's claim to be a professional soldier simply following orders with the weight of the documentary evidence presented at trial. Lisa Keitel, born Lisa Fontaine, had married Wilhelm Keitel in 1909 and had been his partner through his rise through the ranks of the German military establishment. Keitel was tried at Nuremberg on all 4 counts of the indictment and was convicted on all 4. Sentenced to death, he was hanged on October 16, 1946. The defense argument that Keitel had simply been following the orders of his superiors, specifically Hitler, was rejected by the Nuremberg Tribunal, which established the precedent that following unlawful orders does not absolve an individual of criminal responsibility. This precedent, known broadly as the Nuremberg defense, became one of the most important legal contributions of the Nuremberg process to international law. Lisa Keitel survived her husband and spent her remaining years largely outside the public view. Their son, Baudouin Keitel, who had also served as a military officer, faced his own process of reckoning with his father's legacy. The Keitel family's post-war story is, in many ways, representative of the broader experience of families of Wehrmacht officers who had been convicted at Nuremberg, a combination of private grief, social difficulty, and the gradual reintegration that West German society's relative leniency toward former military personnel made possible. The story of Louisa Funk, wife of Walter Funk, who served as Germany's economics minister and president of the Reichsbank, and was one of the central figures in the economic machinery of the Holocaust, including his personal involvement in the storage of gold taken from the teeth of murdered Jews, illustrates yet another variation on the post-war experience. Funk was tried at Nuremberg and convicted, receiving a life sentence which was subsequently commuted on health grounds, leading to his release in 1957. He died in 1960. Louise Funk survived the immediate post-war period and the years of her husband's imprisonment in a position of considerable private difficulty, the wife of a convicted war criminal in a society that was still figuring out what it thought about the men who had made the Holocaust economically possible. The particular horror of Funk's personal involvement in the so-called gold reserves of the Reichsbank, which included not just looted gold but gold extracted from the teeth of murdered concentration camp victims, made his case one that retained a visceral capacity to shock even observers who were familiar with the broad outlines of the Holocaust. His wife's ability to navigate this legacy in private life represented a small but meaningful test of how post-war German society dealt with the families of those who had been most directly connected to the most shocking individual crimes of the regime. The children of Reinhard Heydrich, whose father had been assassinated in Prague in June 1942, faced a fate that was shaped both by the dramatic circumstances of their father's death and by the deliberate effort of Lena Heydrich to maintain and defend his memory. Heydrich and Lena had 4 children together: Klaus, born 1933, Heider, born 1934, Silke, born 1939, and Martha, born 1942, just weeks before Heydrich's assassination. Klaus Heydrich, the eldest, grew up in post-war Germany carrying one of the most infamous names in the history of the SS, a name associated with the Wannsee Conference, with the systematic murder of the Jews of occupied Europe, with the brutal repression of the Czech population, and with the particularly devastating reprisals that followed his father's assassination, including the complete destruction of the village of Lidis and the murder of all its male inhabitants. Klaus Heydrich lived his adult life under this shadow, and the choices he made about how to relate to his father's legacy and his mother's campaign of posthumous rehabilitation were not always easy or comfortable. Lena Heydrich's determination to defend Reinhard's reputation created significant difficulty for children who might have wished to pursue a quieter or more clearly distanced relationship with the paternal legacy. The broader story of the Heydrich children is one of individuals caught between their mother's unrelenting advocacy and the weight of a historical record that admits of no favourable interpretation of what their father did. The women who served as secretaries, staff members, and close personal associates of the Nazi leadership without being formally married to them represent another dimension of the story of women and the Nazi regime that has received increasing scholarly attention. Christa Schroeder was Hitler's personal secretary from 1933 to 1945 and was present in the Führerbunker during the final weeks of the war. She was captured by American forces and subjected to interrogation, and the accounts she later provided of Hitler's personality and daily habits became an important source for historians studying the human dimensions of the dictator's leadership. She lived until 1984 and eventually published a memoir of her experiences that was widely read in both Germany and abroad. Traudl Junge, who served as Hitler's personal secretary from 1942 until his death and was one of the last people to leave the bunker, became perhaps the most famous of these women following her appearance in the documentary film Blind Spot, Hitler's Secretary, released in 2002, shortly before her death. Junge's testimony provided an intimate portrait of Hitler's daily life in the final months and years of the war, and her late-life reckoning with her own complicity, her acknowledgement that she had chosen not to know or ask too many questions, became one of the most widely discussed personal moral narratives to emerge from the post-war generation of witnesses. She died in 2002 at the age of 81. The story of the women of the Reich extends beyond the most senior wives to include the enormous number of women who served the regime in various professional capacities, from Leni Riefenstahl, whose propaganda films celebrated the Nazi movement with a technical brilliance that made them both artistically significant and morally troubling, to the female guards of the concentration camps who were responsible for some of the most direct acts of violence against Jewish women and other prisoners. Leni Riefenstahl, born in 1902, had been one of the most celebrated filmmakers in Germany before the Nazi period, and her documentary films of the Nuremberg Rally, Triumph of the Will, released in 1935, and of the 1936 Berlin Olympics, Olympia, are still regarded by film scholars as technically extraordinary works that nonetheless served the propaganda purposes of the regime with extraordinary effectiveness. After the war, Riefenstahl was detained and subjected to denazification proceedings on 4 separate occasions, but was ultimately classified as a fellow traveller rather than an active Nazi, a finding that allowed her to resume her career, albeit under conditions of significant public and critical hostility. She consistently maintained throughout her life that she had simply been an artist who had made films, that she had not known about the Holocaust, and that her work had been purely aesthetic rather than political. This position was received with considerable skepticism by historians and critics who noted the degree to which her talent had been placed at the explicit service of the Nazi propaganda machine. She continued to work in photography and film into her 90s, completing a diving documentary when she was over 100 years old, and she died in September 2003 at the age of 101. The question of her guilt and her legacy remains one of the most discussed cases in the history of art and political complicity. The story of the female concentration camp guards is in many ways the most directly challenging dimension of the broader narrative of women and the Nazi regime, because it most directly contradicts any assumption that women's involvement in the system was primarily passive or ignorant. Women were not permitted to serve in the SS itself, but they were permitted to serve as guards in the concentration camps, specifically in the women's sections, where they held positions of enormous power over the prisoners in their charge. The historical record documents extensive and systematic violence by these guards against the women and children in their custody, including beatings, starvation, selection for medical experiments, and direct participation in selections for the gas chambers. The most notorious of these guards, Irma Grieser, who served at Ravensbrück, Auschwitz and Bergen-Belsen, was tried by a British military tribunal after the liberation of Bergen-Belsen in April 1945 and was convicted and hanged on December 13, 1945, at the age of 22. She remains the youngest woman to have been executed, under British law in the 20th century. The broader number of female camp guards was significant. Approximately 3,500 women served as Aufseherinnen, or female supervisory guards, in the Nazi concentration camp system during the war, and the majority of them were neither tried nor significantly punished after the war. their fates, and the question of how a large number of ordinary German women came to participate directly in the operation of the Holocaust, has been one of the most productive areas of recent Holocaust scholarship, with works like Wendy Lower's Hitler's Furies offering important analysis of the mechanisms by which ordinary women were drawn into direct participation in extraordinary evil. Turning to the question of how post-war West Germany handled the formal legal accountability of the women who had been most directly involved with the Nazi leadership, it is worth noting that the legal framework of denazification, while it produced some meaningful outcomes, was broadly regarded even at the time as inadequate. The denazification process was conducted differently in each of the 4 occupation zones and was formally transferred to German authorities in the Western zones in 1946, with the Americans having taken the most systematic approach and the British having been somewhat less thorough. The categories into which individuals were sorted ranged from major offenders at the top to exonerated at the bottom, with offenders, lesser offenders, and followers in between. The majority of Germans who were processed were classified in the 2 lowest categories, paying relatively small fines and facing limited restrictions on their professional activities. Women were treated particularly leniently in this process, both because the formal criteria emphasized positions of authority within the Nazi state and party, which relatively few women officially held, and because of a widespread cultural assumption that women's involvement in the regime had been primarily domestic and therefore less culpable than men's. The consequences of this leniency were significant and long-lasting. Many of the women who had been deeply involved in the ideological and social infrastructure of the Nazi movement were able to resume their lives with minimal formal interruption, and some of them went on to participate in networks of post-war mutual support that helped former Nazis evade full accountability. The question of how children of Nazi perpetrators have grappled with their inheritance has become increasingly studied and publicly discussed as the generation of children who grew up in the immediate post-war period has aged and as the last survivors of the Holocaust have passed away or reached extreme old age. Organizations like the Descendants of Holocaust Perpetrators and Survivors, which brings together children and grandchildren of both victim families and perpetrator families for dialogue and mutual education, represent one institutional response to the complex human question of how to process inherited responsibility across generations. Some children and grandchildren of senior Nazis have become active in Holocaust education and remembrance, speaking in schools and public forums about the impact of their family histories on their personal development and advocating for continued serious engagement with the history of the Nazi period. Others have chosen silence, unable or unwilling to engage publicly with histories they find personally overwhelming. And a small but significant minority have followed the path of figures like Gudrun Himmler, maintaining loyalty to the perpetrator's memory in ways that have brought them into conflict with historical accuracy and with the ongoing work of justice for the victims. The contrast between these different responses to the same fundamental challenge is perhaps most sharply illustrated when we place 2 specific individuals in direct comparison. Nicholas Frank, son of the Butcher of Poland, and Gudrun Himmler, daughter of the architect of the Holocaust, inhabited the same post-war Germany, faced the same fundamental question about what to do with their father's legacies, and came to diametrically opposed answers. Nicholas Frank chose radical public denunciation, writing books that confronted his father's crimes in terms so unsparing that some readers found them more cathartic than historically informative. Gudrun Himmler chose active defense and practical support for individuals, convicted of some of the worst crimes her father's organization had perpetrated. Both were responding to the same impossible inheritance, and the fact that they chose such completely different paths is a reminder that the response to a legacy of evil is not determined by the nature of the legacy itself, but by something more deeply personal, by character, by the relationships and experiences of a lifetime, by the particular moral courage or moral failure that each individual brings to the question of who they choose to be. The grandchildren of the Nazi leadership have generally had more distance from the immediate trauma of the war and its aftermath, and the few who have spoken publicly about their family histories have done so with varying degrees of engagement with the specific historical and moral dimensions of what their grandparents did. Catherine Himmler, the great-niece of Heinrich Himmler, published a book in 2007 titled The Himmler Brothers that explored the family history and represented an attempt to engage seriously and self-critically with the legacy of one of the most powerful men in the Nazi state. Her work was well received by historians and by the broader public as an example of the kind of honest, uncomfortable family history that serves the cause of collective memory. The contrast between Catherine Himmler's approach and the approach of her relative Gudrun Himmler could hardly be more stark, and it illustrates how within a single family, the question of how to relate to an inherited legacy can produce radically divergent responses across different generations and different individuals. The story of how other European nations dealt with the families of their own wartime collaborators and fascist leaders adds an important comparative dimension to the primarily German-focused narrative we have traced so far. In France, the wives of prominent collaborators faced varying degrees of accountability through the purge, known as the epuration, that followed the liberation. The epuration included both formal legal proceedings against the most serious cases and extrajudicial violence against perceived collaborators, and women who had been associated with the Vichy regime or with German occupiers faced particular forms of gendered punishment, most notoriously the public head-shaving of women accused of having had romantic relationships with German soldiers. The formal legal proceedings against Vichy's senior figures were more limited. Marshal Philippe Pétain, the head of the Vichy government, was tried and convicted of treason, sentenced to death, and then had his sentence commuted to life imprisonment by Charles de Gaulle, who cited Pétain's age and his service in the First World War as mitigating factors. Pétain died in prison on the Île d'Yeu on July 23, 1951, at the age of 95. His wife, Eugénie Hardon, remained devoted to him throughout his imprisonment and advocated without success for his release. She outlived him by more than a decade, dying in 1962. In Italy, the experiences of the families of mid-level fascist officials and administrators were shaped by the amnesty legislation of 1946, known as the Togliatti Amnesty, after the Communist Party leader who proposed it, which effectively ended the prosecution of the vast majority of those who had served the fascist regime in various capacities. The amnesty was widely criticized even at the time as premature and insufficiently discriminating, and its practical effect was to allow a very large number of individuals with significant fascist track records to resume professional and civic life with minimal interruption. The wives and children of these individuals thus found themselves in a society that had officially renounced fascism as a political system, while being remarkably lenient in practice toward those who had implemented it. This created a particular kind of social ambiguity that shaped Italian political culture for decades, and the tension between official anti-fascism and the practical rehabilitation of former fascists has been a persistent theme in Italian historical and political debate from the immediate post-war period to the present. The Spanish case was distinctive in that there was no Allied occupation and no externally imposed denazification, because Spain, despite Franco's evident sympathies with Hitler and Mussolini, had maintained a formal neutrality during most of the war. Franco remained in power until his death in 1975, and, during his lifetime, there was no systematic reckoning with the crimes of the Civil War period, or with the execution of tens of thousands of Republicans in the years following 1939. The transition to democracy that followed Franco's death was managed through a process of negotiated amnesia, formalized in the amnesty law of 1977, which effectively prevented any legal prosecution of crimes committed during the Civil War and the subsequent repression. The wives and children of senior Francoist officials thus faced no formal accountability whatsoever, and the question of historical reckoning for the crimes of the Francoist regime has been addressed primarily through scholarship, memorialization efforts, and the work of civil society organizations rather than through the courts. Spain's law of historical memory, passed in 2007, represented a belated attempt to provide some formal recognition to the victims of Francoist repression, but it stopped well short of the kind of comprehensive legal accountability that characterized the Nuremberg process. The Japanese case adds another important dimension to our understanding of how the families of wartime leaders fared in the immediate post-war period and beyond. The International Military Tribunal for the Far East, known informally as the Tokyo Trials, convicted 25 senior Japanese military and political leaders of war crimes and crimes against peace, sentencing 7 of them, including General Hideki Tojo, to death by hanging in December 1948. The wives of these men faced personal circumstances broadly analogous to those of the wives of the Nuremberg defendants, though the specific cultural and social context was, of course, very different. Katsuko Tojo, the wife of General Tojo, remained in Japan after her husband's execution, and lived quietly until her death in 1982. The treatment of the families of convicted Japanese war criminals in post-war Japan was shaped by the broader context of the American occupation, which imposed significant reforms on Japanese political and social structures, while also, controversially, choosing not to prosecute Emperor Hirohito himself for his role in the war, a decision that had enormous implications for the nature and completeness of Japan's post-war reckoning. The decision to spare the emperor was driven primarily by the American assessment that maintaining the imperial institution would be essential for political stability and for the smooth administration of the occupation, but it meant that the full chain of command responsible for Japan's wartime aggression and atrocities was never fully traced in the courts. The women who stood beside some of the most brutal dictators of the latter half of the 20th century in Africa, Asia, and Latin America faced a wide range of fates that reflected the enormous diversity of political contexts in which those dictatorships operated. The wife of Romanian dictator Nicolae Ceausescu, Elena, was executed alongside him on Christmas Day 1989, as we discussed earlier, making her one of the very few women in the 20th century to be formally executed for her role in a totalitarian regime. The wife of Libyan dictator Muammar Gaddafi, Safia Farkash, escaped to Algeria with several of her children after Gaddafi was captured and killed by rebel forces in October 2011. She subsequently sought asylum in various countries, facing legal proceedings in several jurisdictions related to assets allegedly belonging to the Libyan state. Her case illustrated the complex legal and diplomatic challenges created when the families of fallen dictators attempt to move from one country to another while carrying both substantial financial resources and significant political baggage. The children of Muammar Gaddafi themselves represent one of the most dramatically documented cases of the collapse of a dictatorial dynasty in the modern era. Gaddafi had 8 children, both biological and adopted, and several of them held significant positions within the regime before its collapse. His son, Saif al-Islam Gaddafi, had been presented as the regime's potential modernizing reformer, completing a doctoral degree from the London School of Economics and cultivating relationships with Western academics and officials who believed he represented a more pragmatic and less ideologically extreme version of his father's politics. When the Libyan civil war began in 2011, Saif al-Islam chose to remain with his father's regime rather than attempting to broker a transition, and he was captured by rebel forces in November 2011. He was tried by a Libyan court in absentia and sentenced to death in 2015, though his case has remained legally complicated for years. Another of Gaddafi's sons, Mutassim, was captured and killed by rebel forces shortly after his father. Khamis Gaddafi, who commanded one of the most feared military brigades of the regime, was reported killed in combat during the civil war. The dramatic and violent end of the Gaddafi family's hold on power illustrates how, in dictatorships without the kind of orderly post-war settlement that characterized the end of the Second World War, the families of dictators can face immediate physical danger rather than the delayed legal proceedings and social difficulties that characterized the experience of Nazi families in post-war Germany. Throughout the stories we have told in this video, one theme recurs with particular insistence: the question of what it means to know and what moral responsibility attaches to proximity without direct participation. The wives of senior Nazis knew, to varying degrees, what their husbands were doing. They benefited, materially and socially, from the spoils of a regime whose crimes they either understood or chose not to examine too closely. Some, like Margaret Himmler, left explicit written evidence that they understood something of the nature of the occupied territories their husbands governed. Others, like Emmy Goering, lived in extraordinary material luxury sustained directly by the plunder of Jewish property, while maintaining that their primary role was domestic. The question of what they knew and what their knowledge obligated them to do or refuse has no simple answer, but it is a question that any serious reckoning with the history of the Nazi period must address. The children faced a different version of the same question, not what did they know during the war, since most were too young to have understood or to have been told, but what did they choose to know, believe and do afterward, when the choices were genuinely their own. The historian Dan Stone has written powerfully about the long shadow of genocide and totalitarian rule on the families and communities of both perpetrators and victims, arguing that the full moral and social consequences of events like the Holocaust continue to work themselves out across generations in ways that are not fully visible until decades have passed. The stories we have traced in this video illustrate exactly this kind of long-term consequence. The wives of the Nazi leadership who were still alive in the 1960s and 1970s existed in a West Germany that was officially committed to democratic values and to the acknowledgement of the Holocaust as a central crime of the modern era, while simultaneously containing a large population of individuals who had participated in or benefited from the Nazi regime and who were continuing to live their daily lives in relative normalcy. The children who were making their adult choices in the 1960s and 1970s were doing so in a society that was actively reckoning with these contradictions shaped by the Eichmann trial in 1961 and the subsequent explosion of public debate about the Holocaust in Germany. The grandchildren who came of age in the 1990s and 2000s did so in the context of a Germany that had by then built an extensive institutional infrastructure of Holocaust memory, from the memorial to the murdered Jews of Europe in central Berlin, to the hundreds of local memorial sites and educational programs that make Germany one of the most systematically engaged nations in the world with the question of its own historical crimes. Understanding how the families of the perpetrators related to this evolving national conversation is part of understanding how Germany itself has navigated the impossible challenge of living with its history. The final question that any exploration of the fates of dictators' wives and children must address is whether there is something meaningful to be said about moral inheritance and its limits. Are the children of perpetrators responsible for their parents' crimes? The legal answer is clearly no, and no serious legal philosopher or historian would argue otherwise. But the moral question is more complex. Children who benefit materially from their parents' crimes, who receive the education and social position that those crimes made possible, who live in households where the crimes are defended and celebrated rather than acknowledged and mourned, do occupy a position of at least partial implication that goes beyond simple legal innocence. At the same time, the extraordinary examples of individuals like Nicholas Frank, who dedicated their adult lives to the public denunciation of their parents' crimes, or Svetlana Alliluyeva, who defected from her father's political system and spent the rest of her life articulating a vision of human dignity that his regime had systematically violated, demonstrate that the inheritance of a perpetrator's legacy is not a destiny. It is a challenge, and how individuals respond to that challenge tells us something important about the capacity of human beings to resist the moral gravity of the environments in which they were formed. The stories of these women and children are ultimately stories about the relationship between personal life and historical catastrophe, about the way in which the largest and most impersonal forces of politics and ideology work themselves out through the intimate details of individual families, marriages, and generational relationships. They are stories that resist simple conclusions, that defy the comfortable binary of victim and perpetrator, that demand from us a willingness to hold complexity and moral seriousness simultaneously. They are stories we need to keep telling because the crimes they illuminate were made possible not only by the monstrous few at the top, but by the many who supported, enabled, benefited from, and lived alongside the machinery of evil. And they are stories that remind us that the work of understanding and accounting for such crimes is not finished when the last war criminal is tried or when the last survivor passes away, but continues to be the work of every generation that inherits the consequences of choices it did not make and crimes it did not commit, but must nonetheless confront with honesty, courage, and an unwillingness to look away. Beyond the high-profile figures who have attracted the most historical attention, there were thousands of lesser-known wives and children of mid-ranking and low-ranking Nazi officials, SS men, camp guards, and party functionaries whose post-war experiences were shaped by a combination of the formal denazification process and the practical realities of post-war West German society. The scholar Robert Geladley has documented how the Nazi regime enjoyed genuine popular support from broad sections of German society throughout much of the war, and this observation has significant implications for how we understand the post-war experiences of the families left behind. A regime supported by a substantial proportion of the population produces an enormous number of families with some degree of complicity in its functioning, and the practical impossibility of prosecuting or formally sanctioning anything like the full number of individuals who participated in or benefited from the Nazi system meant that West German society in the 1950s was populated at every level by people carrying experiences and associations that were never formally addressed. The wives of ordinary SS men who had served as guards in concentration camps, for example, were in the vast majority of cases never subjected to any formal proceedings. They built their post-war lives, raised their children, and in many cases contributed to the social networks that helped former SS men and their families maintain a degree of mutual support and shared identity within post-war society. The historian Annette Tim has written about how the Waffen-SS veterans organisation, CHIAG, founded in 1951, served not only as an advocacy group for former SS men seeking pension and legal recognition, but also as a social infrastructure that included family members, providing a context in which the experiences and identities of the wartime period could be maintained and transmitted across generations. The question of how children discover and process the wartime activities of their parents has been studied by clinical psychologists as well as by historians, and the findings are both varied and consistent in their documentation of the psychological weight that this discovery typically carries. Interviews conducted with children of perpetrators, particularly by scholars working with organizations committed to Holocaust education and remembrance, consistently document a pattern in which initial ignorance or protective denial gives way to a process of discovery that is typically experienced as profoundly destabilizing. The specific manner in which this discovery occurs, whether through formal education, family documents, chance encounters with historical texts or testimony, or direct confrontation with the parents themselves, shapes the subsequent psychological trajectory in significant ways. Those who discover the truth in early childhood, before they have the cognitive and emotional framework to process it, face different challenges from those who encounter it as teenagers or adults, and those who discover it through sympathetic engagement with the experiences of victims, for example, through contact with survivor testimony, are better positioned to develop an empathetic moral response than those who encounter the evidence primarily through the defensive prism of family loyalty and parental protection. The therapeutic and educational community that has developed to work specifically with descendants of Nazi perpetrators represents one of the most interesting institutional responses to the long-term human consequences of the Holocaust. Organizations and therapy groups specifically for children and grandchildren of Nazis have been established in Germany and elsewhere, recognizing that the inherited burden of having perpetrators in the family tree creates specific psychological challenges that require specific forms of support. Some of these groups bring together descendants of perpetrators and descendants of victims in facilitated dialogue, a process that can be extraordinarily painful for all involved, but that has also been documented to produce significant shifts in understanding and in the capacity for empathy across the generational divide. The assumption that the moral consequences of the Holocaust were limited to its immediate survivors and perpetrators has been comprehensively disproved by decades of psychological research and human experience, and the ongoing work of organizations that address these multi-generational consequences is an important part of the broader project of Holocaust memory and education. The legacy question becomes particularly acute when we consider not the children, but the grandchildren and great-grandchildren of the Nazi leadership, who are now in the position of making decisions about archives, family properties, family memoirs, and public statements about their family histories in a world that is moving further from the events in question, even as the political circumstances that make historical awareness essential appear to be shifting in troubling directions. Several of the grandchildren of senior Nazi officials have chosen to engage publicly with their family histories in ways that have attracted widespread attention, including through documentary films, published memoirs, and public speaking. Some have established foundations or contributed to educational institutions specifically focused on Holocaust memory. Others have chosen the opposite path, maintaining silence or even defending their grandparents in terms that historians have found difficult to reconcile with the evidentiary record. The range of responses within a single generation of grandchildren is as wide as the range we observed in the generation of children, suggesting that proximity to the events in time is not the determining factor in how individuals choose to relate to this inheritance. The international dimension of the post-war dispersal of Nazi families deserves brief mention as well. Argentina was the most famous destination for Nazi war criminals who fled Europe after the war, with a significant number of former SS officers and other Nazi functionaries settling in Buenos Aires and in smaller cities and rural areas of Argentina during the late 1940s and 1950s. The conditions that made this possible, including the sympathy of the Perón government and the operation of a series of escape networks sometimes called the rat lines, have been documented by historians, including Uki Gonyi. The wives and children of these men accompanied them in many cases, creating communities of German-speaking expatriates in Argentina, Brazil, Paraguay, and other Latin American countries whose relationship to the Nazi past was complex and often deliberately unexamined. The children born to these families in their new countries grew up with particular versions of the family history, versions that in many cases minimized or denied the nature of their father's wartime activities and the experience of discovering the truth about those activities against the backdrop of a South American, rather than a European, cultural context, was distinctive in ways that have not been as thoroughly studied as the experience of those who remained in Germany. The stories of the wives and children of the world's infamous dictators ultimately converge on a single irreducible truth: that the moral consequences of absolute power and organized evil do not respect the boundaries between the public and the private, between the historical and the personal, between the guilty and the innocent who happen to share a surname. The women who married these men, the children who were born to them, were not abstractions. They were human beings who woke up every morning, made decisions about how to live their days, and shaped their identities in the context of histories that were not of their choosing, but that were, nonetheless, inescapably theirs. Some of them face those histories with a courage and an honesty that serves as an example of the human capacity for moral growth, even under the most difficult circumstances. Others evaded, denied, and defended in ways that extended the harm of the original crimes into subsequent generations. And most occupied the complicated middle ground between these extremes, doing what human beings mostly do: trying to live, to love, to construct a meaningful existence, while carrying the weight of a past that no amount of personal distance could fully erase. It is their full, complicated, and deeply human stories that we have tried to tell today.